There is never a good time to make tough decisions. There will always be an election or something else around the corner. Governance is about making tough decisions, even unpopular ones. Is this government making the tough decisions that Sri Lanka needs during these times of turmoil? Where is Sri Lanka really headed? The country as a whole is in hot water on a number of grounds, economically, on our human rights record, and if there really is a plan moving forward. The sentiment among many is that the economic situation in Sri Lanka will continue to depreciate in the future, but we've got members of our legislature today to discuss what really is in store for us in the future as a country. Before we continue any further, let me introduce our eminent panel that we've got on Face the Nation for tonight. On my right-hand side, we've got President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthiran, parliamentarian from the Tamil National Alliance. On his left, we've got, I beg your pardon, on his right, we've got Professor Tissa Vitharana. He is the chairman of the Committee on Public Accounts. Professor, you were of the opinion that you wouldn't get re-elected as the chairman of COPA, but here you are once again. Congratulations, Professor, on your appointment, and thank you very much for representing the government, of course, on Face the Nation. And finally, we've got Mr. Iran Vikramaratne, parliamentarian from the Samagi Janawala. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Sumanthiran, sir, for joining us on our program. Well, as usual, we meet you today, of course, on Valentine's Day, a day that we're supposed to spread love, probably spend time with our family and our loved ones. But we are here to face the nation and keep the general public abreast at what is happening, especially during these turbulent times that our country is facing. I'd first like to direct my question to President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthiran. So, like I said at the beginning, Sri Lanka is in a bit of a fix as far as Sri Lanka's human rights record goes. We've been discussing a reconciliation process. Now we've got more issues piling up in the form of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and especially the ramped up use of this piece of legislation to prosecute many individuals that human rights groups, including the United Nations and even certain regional blocs, including the European Union, believe that it shouldn't be used to prosecute those crimes. So, the President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthiran, on Sri Lanka's human rights situation, there is the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions coming up in a few weeks. Where do we really stand? How much of damage control are we looking at the United Nations Human Rights Council? Can we really convince the international community that we have lived up to the international standards on human rights?
No, I don't think we can. It's not a question of damage control for the country. It's a question of our commitment to human rights and whether we as we owe it to the people, whether we have upheld the standards that are expected of a country. That's a question. UN Human Rights Council is a check that comes 3 times a year, and if we are to do window dressing to satisfy the Human Rights Council in Geneva, then I don't think we will ever succeed, and in any case that won't be a genuine effort. The High Commissioner for Human Rights will give her report in a few days' time. I think a copy of the report would be given to the government of Sri Lanka tomorrow or so. We expect the report to be pretty harsh on Sri Lanka because time and again the Human Rights Council has brought to the country's attention many of its failings with regard to the human rights situation in the country. And Sri Lanka has made several promises, undertakings, and has not lived up to the promises that it made. One notable example is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, acknowledged worldwide as a draconian piece of legislation. It's a very strange piece of legislation because in 1979, when it was brought as a temporary provisions act. Even now, the title to the act is temporary provisions for 6 months. Then government said that there was a special situation that had arisen and was bringing this act for a period of 6 months, during which that special issue in the country would be contained, and we have now lived with that law for 42 long years. And during the process, many people have suffered under that act, and so after the war ended, particularly the government of Sri Lanka has made many promises to repeal it, and to date it has not been repealed. They have tabled an amending act bill in Parliament that doesn't really amend anything. Absolutely nothing is going to be amended by that bill that has been presented to Parliament. So the government not only trying to fool the UN Human Rights Council, it's fooling its people, it's in fact fooling itself by presenting that kind of bill to Parliament. No one will be convinced by that. So, but this is an example. By such acts, you only make yourself vulnerable to criticism from the civilized world that your human rights situation is far from ideal.
But President's Counsel M.A. Sumantiran, the argument, at least, that seems to be propounded by the government is the fact that national security is our #1 priority. We had the April 21st attacks. Subsequently, even recently, in recent months, I believe in January this year, we had a grenade that was left at the All Saints Church in Borella, and the government needs to ensure the national security of the general public for the greater good of the entire country. That is why we need this act.
No, this act actually is counterproductive. I'll give you just one example. I have said this in Parliament a number of times. Almost 30 years ago, as a young attorney, I represented a couple, a husband and wife, who were charged under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for failure to give information to the police about a certain individual. Call him A, individual A. They were supposed to have known him but did not tell the police about him. That was a charge against them. They were arrested, kept in remand for 2 years. They were forced to sign confessions, so they had signed their confessions. Now this individual A was also arrested, but despite torture, he did not sign a confession. So they let him go. Now when I appeared for them in court, he came to watch the proceedings. Now here I was appearing for this couple, and there was that man seated in the well of court watching the proceedings. So I told the judge, you know, they are charged with not giving information to the police about this person, and he's here. Just come to see what's happening. So that's the situation. Police lost all their ability to investigate and find culprits because of the provisions of this law. You only had to extract a confession from someone and the crime is solved, while the real perpetrator still walks free, is still on the roads. So far from being efficient, it actually worked in the opposite direction, where it was counterproductive. So 42 years of this law did not stop 30-year or so war from north and east. In between, you had a second insurrection of the JVP. Right? This law did not contain that. In fact, I would argue that this law contributed towards that kind of situation in the country.
Thank you very much, President's Counsel M.A. Sumanthira. And I now move my attention to Mr. Iran Vikramaratne, Samagijana Balavegya parliamentarian. Mr. Vikramaratne, of course, as an economist, this topic would be bread and butter for you. The surcharge bill that has been presented by the government. Now, although people who are well versed with the subject of economics really understands the impact that this will have on the lives of every single person living in Sri Lanka. The government recently announced a 5,000 rupee increase in or an allowance for all state employees, but all of those will mean nothing if this surcharge bill is passed, and if the Employees Provident Fund, or the profits of the Employees Provident Fund, the profits of the Employees Trust Fund and other employees' funds are acquired by this one-time tax, the surcharge bill. Just for the benefit of the general public who are watching our show right now, if you could explain in real simple terms what this surcharge bill means and how will it impact the people who are watching our show right now.
Thank you for inviting me to be on Face the Nation. Before I get to the bad news, let me also say Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I had the same Valentine for the last 40 years. Hopefully she's listening to it as well. Yeah, so the surcharge bill that is being presented is, there are many problems with it. One is it's retrospective. So you're going back in time and you're taking money from companies, the surcharge bill. Generally, when it comes to taxation, being retrospective is not good, because...
Is it not good or is it illegal?
That's for the courts to determine, and that argument is going to be made in court. Soon after Thursday, that argument is being made in court. So it's not good from a business point of view, for sure. Because businesses don't mind paying taxes, but businesses want certainty. You see, that's the only way they can plan the future and they can plan their businesses. So this creates uncertainty. So that's one big issue with this. The other issue with this surcharge bill is, apart from it applying to individuals and to companies, it also applies to the Employees Provident Fund. Now, that's a huge problem, and I'm saying this because no government minister, even though we raised it in Parliament this past week, came forward and actually said no, it does not apply to the EPF. So we have to still assume now that it applies to the EPF. So one fundamental issue is...
Mr. Vikramaratne, I believe that's an established fact, because the bill refers to the definition in the Inland Revenue Act.
That's
the Inland
right.
Revenue Act definition includes the Employees Provident Fund and the Trust Fund.
That's right. So if the government was going to make an exception, then they should have made a statement about it and taken the EPF out of it. Now,
so by implication, it is included.
It is included by implication. So we may be having about 2 million people, or somewhere approximately there, who are contributors to the Employees Provident Fund. Now, when a person works his lifetime, 30 years, 40 years, right, he could be paying taxes during that period, or income taxes. Then after he pays the income taxes, this is put as a saving. You see, the EPF, the ETF becomes a saving. A few people will have a pension when they retire, but most people don't have a pension, so they will rely on their EPF savings. Now, as you know, the longevity of life has increased quite considerably over the last 20-30 years. You see, people, instead of living 60 years, are living into the 80s and 90s, which means their post-retirement period is also longer. So lots of people are dependent on this. They're dependent on this saving to sometimes maybe give a daughter in marriage. Maybe if they have taken a loan to pay for a house or a property, they want to settle the bank when they are retiring, and get the ownership transferred, right? And then for monthly expenses, they need this benefit. So in principle, we shouldn't be taxing retirer benefits, you see, in principle. So we are objecting to it based on that's not the proper thing to do. Now this is a very convenient thing for a finance minister, because he has a deficit, and very recently the government has been talking of taking 100 billion rupees, and I've tried to inquire how they're going to use this 100 billion rupees, and it doesn't seem to be that they are using it in a very productive manner. And out of that 100 billion, based on certain assumptions, about 65 billion can be taken from the EPFs. So it's easy, because the finance minister knows that in one swipe he can take this. The EPF is the largest fund the country has, running into several trillion, and he just in a swipe he takes his money away. So when you finally retire and you are getting your EPF, you get it on your accumulation in your account, because the fund is managed, and every year there is a dividend declared, and that dividend is apportioned to every EPF member. So your personal fund grows. I also worked in the private sector and have no retirement pension from the private sector, and therefore your EPF grows. So this is actually taking some of that money away. So that is why, that is the way it will affect these people, and we are really telling the government to withdraw this.
Mr. Vikramaratne, are you in a position to maybe analyze the situation and just inform the general public? Say an average person who earns about 30,000 rupees a month, how much would it slash? I'm just popping you this question over the head. I don't know if you can really give a...
Yeah, that's difficult to say, because in the budget speech, the finance minister said, this is one-time tax, okay? The problem is when you create a precedence, right? You can repeat it, one. The second is when one government has done it, another government can do it as well.
And say, look, they did it, we're doing it again.
Yeah, and you have established it, so why don't we do it? So in principle, right at the outset, right, everybody must oppose this, because the principle is wrong. And we are living in a country where life expectancy is growing, right? And therefore the social benefits are really not there to the extent that is needed, particularly for the elderly, you see. And therefore trying to take away from the elderly is criminal, because we should be actually taking care of the elderly. Instead of that, we are taking what they have legitimately saved for themselves, to look after themselves, so that they won't be a burden on the treasury or on the government, and we are taking that away from them. So this is totally unacceptable.
Thank you very much, Parliamentarian Iran Vikramaratne. We now turn our attention to Professor Tisavitarana. Once again, Professor, thank you very much for joining us on our show and representing, of course, the government of Sri Lanka. Professor Tisavitarana, fire from all ends, not very good news. People are dissatisfied with what the government is doing. But of course, like I said at the beginning of the show, governance is about making tough decisions and sometimes unpopular decisions. So Professor Tisavitarana, I will give you a little bit of extra time, of course, because there were two members of the opposition speaking. So firstly, let's speak about the surcharge bill. Tough decision for sure, unpopular decision also for sure. But Professor, do you believe that it has been taken in the interest of the general public?
I hold a different point of view, in the sense that that the government needs money, and the government should take it from those who have it. And the maximum taxation is 14% personal tax, which is extremely low. Here the country is in crisis. And in that situation, the poor are being burdened. About 60% are living below the poverty line. And in that context, you can't tax them anymore. So you have to tax the rich. And to have a personal tax of 14%, I think is absurd in this particular situation. It should be increased. Now, for instance, generally in most countries, it's around 30–40%. And when we had having a crisis at the moment, and in 1970s when we had a severe crisis, the finance minister at that time even increased it to 70%, and that's how he managed to balance the deficit. So I think the total concept is wrong, and certainly taxing EPF, ETF and all that is really not acceptable in any way, because as Iran said, we are this is money which has been collected by people who have been working to ensure that they are able to survive once they've completed work. It's equivalent would be to cut pensions of government workers, which again is something that is reprehensible, and it's not done, as far as I know, anywhere. So the private sector here too should not be subject to a tax of this nature.
Professor Tisavitharan, you've always been known to speak the truth. Despite of which faction you're representing, you had your reservations as to if you will be reappointed as the chairman of COPA. However, we're thankful that you're appointed to this position of power so that you can exercise some oversight over what's happening here in Sri Lanka. Professor, I'll ask you one question. You might get into trouble depending on what answer you give to this question. There is one massive allegation that is being leveled against this government, that this government is in cahoot with certain leading businessmen. Let's not name people or businesses for that matter, because they're not represented here. But judging by the facts, or judging by what you said, is there any truth to this somewhere?
As to that particular allegation, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's hearsay. So I don't like to comment on a matter like that. But the fact is that the government is allowing prices of goods to be increased at random. But there is no control, and in that context, at least there should be countermeasures taken. For instance, state intervention. Just to give you an example, food prices are soaring. People are finding it difficult to live. There are some people I know who are having just one meal a day. So now, in that context, I think the duty of the government is to see that the burden on the people is minimized, where they are able to get a reasonable income, and if there are a large proportion of people who are not getting that income, are having a hard time, my view is that dry ration should be given weekly to those families who are living below the poverty line. So there has to be intervention by government in that way. Then again, if you look at the question of prices, the state institutions like the cooperative setup. Now earlier we had the food control department, there were various state organizations that were providing the essentials at a reasonable price, marketing department and so on. So really there must be government intervention at this juncture to ensure that the mudalalis are not able to make the huge profits that they are making by having adequate competition from the state sector.
Gentlemen, I believe there has been some fruition to the discussion that we've been having, at least on the front of the surcharge bill. I believe we're about to receive some information regarding an assurance given by the Finance Minister on the non-inclusion of the EPF and the ETF in this surcharge bill, but we're still awaiting confirmation on that news item. But as we wait for that, of course, one final question to you, Professor Thiss. We also spoke about Sri Lanka's human rights record. Now, the government is saying that they're doing everything that they can to ensure human rights. They've presented an amendment bill to the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It took quite a long time because this was, of course, the promise of many governments that came into power, and it's been 2.5 years, close to 3 years since this government came into power. Now they've presented an amendment bill. Professor, do you believe that enough has been done on this front? Is the amendment bill to the PTA enough to keep in line with international standards?
I must confess, I haven't studied it. So I really don't want to make any criticisms. But I would say that PTA at this juncture is not really necessary, considering the fact that we have a situation, there is no terrorism in the country, there is peace in all parts of the country. If one is able to travel and do business or to do any type of activity in safety, so that I am for the withdrawal of the PTA as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Professor Thiss Vitarana. Of course, as our show goes on as usual, up next is the opportunity for our journalist to grill the panelists. And we've got two journalists here tonight. On my right, Hassan Shazuli, and on my left, the famous Shehan Ranatunga. So let's start off with Hassan.
Thank you, Shalan. I think I'll pose my first question to Professor Thiss Vitarana. You were speaking about expressing your objection rather to several matters. You said that a surcharge tax must not be imposed, and then you said that the government must focus on minimizing the burden of the people, and you also said that the PTA is not necessary. That was basically summing up what you made in your opening remarks. However, Professor, the question that came to my mind when you were expressing those remarks is that you continue to make these statements while being in the government. I have asked this question from SLFP lawmakers as well, because what we see nowadays is that they come out, they express their objection, continue to hold positions in the government, still oppose the government's decisions, and nothing is being done. We know that you are from the Lanka Samasamaja party, but what is the thought process behind remaining in the government while all these issues are taking place?
No, look here, there is, so I say, different political philosophies in the country. There is the right wing, there is the center and the left wing. They're representing different interests. And from the point of view of my party, for instance, as the LSSP, we call this economy a capitalist economy, where there is exploitation of the workers accumulation of capital, and there is the rich and the super rich, and a big gap between the rich and the poor. So in this context, the burden must not be placed on the poor, who are already under stress, and it is the rich and the super rich who should bear that burden. And that is why I am for, in a situation of crisis like what we are facing today, for a high level of taxation, at least to tide over this period of crisis that the country is facing.
So just to get it clear, you suggest that the government should impose high taxes on businesses. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely.
Professor, I think that begs the question, because when you look at certain decisions that the government has made, we'll start from the decision to change the whole tax structure as soon as it came to power. And then we saw a massive sugar scam where we lost billions of rupees, I believe 15.9 billion rupees. It's estimated to be more than that. And then we paid a compensation of $6.9 million to the Chinese fertilizer ship as well. Now, these money could have been used by the government. However, why do you seem to suggest that we should tax the people who have been working hard, whereas, because it seems that the people have to pay for the government's poor decision making, isn't it?
Decision making is not easy, and I would accept that this government has made mistakes, and they certainly avoidable mistakes. And
in that context, Professor, now since you say that these problems could have been avoided and that we are in this situation because of the wrong decisions made by the government, do you think it is still fair for the government to tax the ordinary taxpayers of this country?
No, you see, when you say ordinary taxpayers, there should be a graded system of taxation, and there should be the lower bracket should be exempt from tax altogether, and thereafter there should be a increasing level of taxation, and the rich and the super rich, which I would say is the largest possessor of capital in the country, should bear the brunt of that taxation.
Professor, if I can just, on the same point, Mr. Vikramaratne, we've been speaking about having a proper tax system in this country for as long as I can remember. Now, taxation is, I believe, one of the biggest income earners for the government. It's how the government functions. It's not just how the Sri Lankan government functions, it's how governments across the world function. But the special situation, at least in Sri Lanka, is the fact that people who have, let's face facts, Mr. Vikramaratne, despite which government was in power, say, United National Party, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna now, if you are connected with the government, you can evade paying taxes. This is a common secret. This is a common secret that everybody knows. So, in such a context, when certain people are allowed, or not just certain people, not one, two people, but many people who are connected to any member of the government, somehow or other they can find loopholes in the system and find a way out, there is really no reason for a person to be motivated to pay taxes for the betterment of a country. Now, in the short run, this would obviously be better for that individual, it would be better for his family, but in the long run, the day that the country really collapses, because, like, for example, what's happening right now. So, I mean, while you're in the opposition even, just a thought that occurred to me. Why doesn't the opposition prepare a tax policy? Since you have so many experts and you claim that the government does not have experts or their experts aren't thinking straight, create a tax policy or how people in Sri Lanka should be taxed. present it to the government, then it's on pen and paper. And if the government refuses to do that, then you all can say, look here, we did this, we didn't just speak about it, we presented it to them, they refused it. When we come into power, we will implement this and we will fix things. Why don't you do that?
Yeah, there is always a social contract between those who govern and those who are governed. And in that social contract, right, the government of the day is responsible for providing certain things. If I were to take something like the right to life, I would convert it economically now to a right to food. You see, people need their basic food. And the government clearly has a role to play in making sure that there is food or protection, you see. So there is a policy in place. Then for health, basic health, right? Then education, right? And so forth and so on. And then in providing these services and a safety net for the vulnerable and the poor, the government has to get revenue. And just as you said, all over the world, governments have to get revenue. So in getting that revenue, you have to follow certain principles. You see, you have to get the tax from those who can pay, right? So there are direct taxes and indirect taxes, right? And then you have to make sure that you have a system in place, a rules-based system where people are paying according to the rules. In doing that, you have to reduce the discretion of the politician. You have to reduce the discretion of the finance minister. You have to, in Sri Lanka, the finance ministers have had traditionally some discretion. So typically, you will find people always talking to the finance minister or outside their door, sort of thing, right? Now, in the last period, right, during the last government, we actually put some of this into practice, because you asked me, what's the plan, what will you do in the future and so forth. So I just need to just go back a little bit to say that.
So there is a blueprint.
They're not only a blueprint, some things were done, and I'm going to explain that, right? So there are largely three sources from which the taxes come. 80% of the country's revenue come from these three sources. One is the Inland Revenue Department, one is the Excise Department, and one is Customs. Now, the Inland Revenue side was reformed, and we came up with a new Inland Revenue Act, right, which is actually was put in place. And that removed the discretion of the minister. So we were moving more and more to a rules-based system. That's what was actually happening. Then what we did was the number of taxpayers in the country, right, was low.
The tax net.
The tax net was low. We increased the tax net in a short period of 2 years by about 600,000. So it went up from about 1 million, 1.1 million to 1.7 million taxpayers in a short space. So people who could avoid will always try to avoid, and that was businesses, and there were also professionals, right, who were basically getting a lot of incomes, right. I don't want to look in, you're smiling at me, and I don't want to look in the direction of lawyers or doctors or anything like that, right. Lots of professionals who earn money, right, who are really, because they are not on the pay system. So it depends on them actually declaring it. And lots of these people were brought into the tax net, and that's how the tax net went up, right? In these last 2 years, that has collapsed again. And again, we have gone back to the old number, about 1.1 million, right, people paying taxes. So that was increased as well. Then there was basically a progressive tax system. On income tax, there was a progressive system. So if you earn more, you pay more. Then for small and medium enterprises, right, for 500 million turnover, 14%, one of the lowest tax rates in the world, but still we impose the tax, because in principle, if there is a big turnover and people are making money, they should be paying taxes. So systematically it was done, and in 2019, the tax revenue in the country went up by 42%. Right? So when the government came into office, they measured it in terms of GDP, revenue was about 11. In 2019, it went to 13.5%. So we were moving in the right direction. Obviously, a lot more had to be done. And it had to be done over a period of time. Now, it was important to provide the services that were required. Also, it was important because the country had been having a budget deficit for a long time. Right? And during those years, 2017 and 18, the budget deficit was 5.3 and 5.4%. right? It had been in 2013 also, it was 5.4%, the budget deficit. But otherwise the budget deficit has been very high. Now the budget deficit may be in double figures and we are not even talking about it. The budget deficit is very, very high. So there was a system, there was a policy, it was pursued. What this government should have done actually is come and actually studied it, right? Because this is nothing to do with governments, these are putting systems right. And actually if they continued with that, they could have even taken it much further, right? Then when it came into things like customs reforms, right, we could not do it because 2019 arrived before we could actually endeavor to do customs reform. So that's another mode of taxation. Then the other thing is simplifying the system. Sri Lanka has thousands of lines of para-tariffs. I can't remember the exact number, between 6,000 and 7,000. The former finance minister, Mangala Samaraweera, in one budget speech, eliminated 1,200 lines of para-tariffs. Over a 5-year period, the plan was to eliminate the para-tariffs. Now, the philosophy behind it was this: businesses are there, reduce the barriers for them, help them to do what they are doing, create value in the economy, right? Create GDP, create incomes, create jobs, value in the economy, and then tax them. Because, and you create social justice through that while value is being created in the economy. That was what it is. So we were going to eliminate the para-tariffs, not like the fertilizer subsidy in one night, over a 5-year period. That's why the first 1,200 were done, and Mangala Samaraweera was going to follow up with it, and we had a certain plan and we were moving in that direction. So answer your question, right, when we are back in office, what will we do? We will certainly follow a plan, we will put the system right, and I don't think that politicians or finance ministers should be given discretion. Given the track record that we have had in this country, I am all for systems rather than depending on individuals.
We've received a message from one of our viewers, and it reads like this. It says, address the elephant in the room. We are struggling financially purely because of successive politicians and their henchmen robbing this country blind. Of course, this is an argument that has been put forward, but we will not subject it to discussion now. A little too in the mainstream. Shehan, yes?
If I might take the next question. Mr. Sumandiran, in fact, the three gentlemen in this room, all three of you were party to a letter, a document which was submitted to the government, which titles A Collective Response to Our Economic Crisis. And the end of the letter, it says, in any path forward, it is essential that the government takes measures to consider the difficulties of the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the country and provide them with adequate social security, protection and relief. Mr. Sumandiran, first of all, could I ask you for the thinking behind this letter? And secondly, do you all believe that this sort of a statement, request to the government, will make a difference?
Well, firstly, the country was facing this huge financial crisis, and we all knew it. Yet it's a responsibility primarily of the government to do something about it, take steps at the right time and so on. But the government was not doing that. So late in the day, I must concede, I just decided that I invite party leaders in the opposition and on the government side a few more people and discuss the way forward, because ultimately Parliament is supposed to have full control over public finances. So that was the thinking behind the convening of these two meetings, the first one on the 27th of January and the second one on the 10th of February. Once we took stock of the situation, the financial situation, we realized that this is unprecedented, not just for one reason, but 4 or 5 reasons. To come out of it needed a collective effort beyond party lines and so on. So this letter, coming to your second question, this letter that we put out expresses expresses a sentiment of first admitting the true state of the country's finances and advising the government on what ought to be done as an urgent measure. And on that, all of us who met together, the 16 of us, if I count right, for the first meeting and the second meeting, agreed on it. So whether it will make a difference, your question, that is left to the government. You see, looking at media reports in the last 2 days, I found that generally there is a welcome to this effort, saying that this is a non-partisan effort and must be commended and so on. We hope that the government also takes it in the right spirit, and they don't even have to meet with us or talk to us. We have stated the obvious. I mean, we have stated the obvious. When I say we stated the obvious, if you run a small business and your business runs into trouble, you have cash flow issues, what do? You run to the bank that has lent you money, and you negotiate. You say, can I not pay the interest for 6 months? Can I delay my repayment? That's what you do. Naturally, that's what you do. You don't wait until the ship sinks, pretending that nothing has happened.
And correct me if I'm wrong, President's Counsel Sumanthiran, the investors or the banks who have invested money in you, they've lent money to you, it's your liability, their investment. They would be all for negotiating a manner in which you don't sink and pay them back.
That's right, because they
what
see
you've taken.
That is true. And also one has to take into account that when some of these people lend to countries like Sri Lanka, the interest is much higher than when they lend to countries in which they face lesser risk. So they take higher risk. They take higher risk in lending. And when it goes wrong, certainly they must share the risk. They must share the pain. You can't let only the borrower face the music. And here the borrower is a country with a population, and so we thought it is important at this stage at least to express these sentiments loud and clear. If the government doesn't pay heed, at least the country knows that this is saner voices that must be taken seriously.
Professor Tisavitharana, this question is for you. In fact, it's from one of our viewers raised this question. If Professor Vitharana is for high taxes, then why is he opposing the surcharge bill? The viewer asks.
It depends on whom you are taxing. Really, I'm against taxing the poor. I'm against taxing those who are finding it, shall I say, even the lower middle class or the middle class. It's those above that who have surplus and can afford to pay the taxes. So that's
now considering the current situation in which that tax has been imposed, now we see that it is a one-time surcharge tax imposed on businesses and individuals who have earned a profit of more than 2 billion rupees in one particular year of assessment. Do you agree with that system?
Yeah, I would.
I think, Professor, now that is the question, because we just received confirmation that Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa has confirmed or assured to Cabinet that the surcharge tax will not be imposed on the Employees Provident Fund and the Employees Trust Fund. Professor Tisavitara, this changes your stance. Now you are in favor of the surcharge tax bill. The two other gentlemen from the opposition, does this change your stance as well?
Well, somewhat. I say that because Honorable Vikramaratne explained earlier with regard to retrospective nature of imposition of this tax. So, that is still objectionable. Apart from the fact that it was going to affect a fund like the EPF, so suddenly to turn back and impose taxes on previous earnings when businesses have not planned for it, that's a very bad idea. The whole thing is because the government in 2019, soon after the presidential election, and you are looking at a parliamentary election, just cut down the taxes. VAT was slashed, personal income tax and all of that was brought, and only now, I mean personally, I became aware of the extent to which our revenue suffered as a result. So it's, and sometimes people ask, well, did it really have that kind of impact on the economy? Right? This is like a slide, a slippery slope. You see, once you start sliding, then you can't. It's difficult to then hold it. So that was the beginning of the slide. So that triggered it off.
Mr. Vikramaratne, just although Professor Tisavitara now sees this as a positive development that the EPF and the ETF is not included, I have one question from you, Mr. Vikramaratne. When the budget was presented, it was clearly stated that they expect to take 100 billion or 65 billion, I believe, from the EPF and the ETF. So wasn't this contemplated back then? Is this a response to the opposition that the public and the opposition, of course, in Parliament had against the EPF and the ETF being taxed? Is this an ad hoc decision? Was this planned?
I don't think that this was planned. So first I would like to say is that it's great that the finance minister has basically taken a step back, because we would have never allowed him to take a step forward on taxing, right, retirer benefits. That's out of the question. So we had to get on the streets almost immediately because of that, because that's so ridiculous. Now you use the word planned. I don't think there's much planning going on, because the government does one thing one day, does another thing another day. Whether you talk about the gas cylinders, or whether you talk about sugar, whether you talk about chemical fertilizers, now whether you are talking about the tax surcharge tax, right? The policy reversals are unbelievable. So that's why I said the word plan doesn't go with this government at all. So there are two issues with this government. One issue is policy. I think they are unclear on policy and very ad hoc on policy, and often pursuing the wrong policy.
But then could you call it policy?
Okay. So they're not consistent anyway. The other thing is very poor management. I think both of these go hand in hand, and poor management. I won't even talk about things like COVID and about the COVID vaccination and all. What a struggle it was, right? When in government they had so many capable people, right? They didn't
like Professor Tisavitara?
Like Professor Tisavitara, they didn't even put them on the task forces, right? So that's why I said one is policy, the other is management, and decision making is atrocious, unbelievable. Now, looking at the crisis that we are facing a huge crisis. And we are hearing conversations on TV trying to say have a positive outlook about Sri Lanka, have a positive outlook about the economy, and we are given all this kind of talk. One, right, the country is blacklisted. So therefore, the access to international markets, right, and international FX markets is closed for Sri Lanka. Now it's been for several months, it's been closed. The second issue is our reserves are the lowest in history. Lowest in history. Normally you like to have 3 months of imports as reserves at a minimum, right? We are less than a month, maybe a couple of weeks, right? Under $1 billion. I don't know the exact number, right? We are very, very low, the lowest in history, right? Then the third issue that we are facing is, right, the government interest as a percentage of revenue is about 70%, right? That is the highest in the world. I'm talking of all the countries in the world. Our interest payments are 70% of our revenue. You can imagine, right, for an individual, for a family, if it's like that. But here this is for the country. And fourthly, right, our debt to GDP ratio, and I won't say that that is just this government. That will be unfair. There's a structural problem. It's been coming over a period of time. But they have worsened it because just in these 2 years, it has gone up by 25%. Just in these 2 years, right? So it's like about 120% is our debt to GDP. I have, of course, added the state-owned enterprises into it as well, because those enterprises can't pay the debt, and there are government often guarantees or letters of comfort. So when you add it up, so this is all of these 4 factors have never come in at the same time. So the country is facing a serious problem. So on the initiative of Mr. Sumanthiran of the TNA, who invited all the party leaders, and also we were glad to see that the chairpersons of the COPA, the COPE, the Public Finance Committee also attended the last meeting. It was a non-partisan meeting, right? And as was explained, it was not a secret meeting. There's nothing secretive about it. It was just a meeting without the media, because people could freely talk and express their views and so forth, right? Everybody knows the crisis is there, and therefore we are saying this is a real crisis, you see. And therefore attend to it quicker, because the longer you postpone it, right, the more drastic steps will have to be taken. Now the thing is, when you take the drastic steps, there people are going to get hurt, right? So to balance it, right, we will have to also look at the social net, right, for the vulnerable, because you have to protect the vulnerable. You see, whatever the crisis is, you know, you can't ignore that. So we'll have to balance it. So now it's up to the government and the finance minister and the government, whether they are just going to blindly go this till the whole thing crashes, or, you know, you can do this you'll be forced to do restructuring if it crashes, or you can choose to do it in an orderly way. It can be done. And all we are saying is, please do it in an orderly way and do it immediately.
Professor Disavitarna, taking on from what Mr. Wickramaratne just said, the people are hurting. And now we just heard that the EPF, ETF and these Nayanda funds will be exempt from that surcharge bill, which all 3 gentlemen agree is a good thing. But in the meantime, while there's still business people who are working and the businesses are driving this economy forward, have to pay this tax, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who are not happy with this. But in the meantime, while the government imposes tax and does these things and makes demands of the public, mismanagement is still rampant in the government. And you yourself have now been reappointed as COPA chairman. Professor, you have a responsibility. There were certain findings made in your previous time as COPA chairman, irregularities brought to light. Are you going to ensure that action is taken over those matters?
Actually, there were, as Iran mentioned, inland revenue, customs and excise. Actually, I think it's not 80%, it's more than 80%. It's about 85 to 90% of our revenue comes from them. And in the course of our investigation, we found that there were some colossal robberies, if I put it in that way, crudely, but honestly, if I put it that way, were taking place. And now just to give you an example, Inland Revenue. Do you know that there are 3 successive appeal boards that anyone who disagrees with the assessment can go to. And when I inquired, the time taken could be a year or more at each stage.
5 years in total?
Yeah, 4.5 years, say. And then in addition, they would even go to courts thereafter.
After the third appeal?
After the third appeal. So I think for one department which has one system, it's ridiculous to have 3 boards of appeal. A single board of appeal with, say, a limited time span should be effectively implemented. This is the question again during the COPA sessions. We found that there were some people who hadn't paid tax for 7 years. And one of the suggestions that I made was that, okay, if they disagree with the official assessment made by the Inland Revenue Department, they will accept that there should be a certain level of taxation which is acceptable to them.
Pay that.
Pay that outright upfront, so that government gets some degree of revenue. I don't know why they were apparently not doing that.
Thank you very much, Professor Tissavitarana. Thank you very much to the rest of the panelists as well. Of course, we're not done for the night. We will just cross over to a short commercial break and on the other side bring you more. I believe all panelists spoke about having a proper plan, making proper decisions. But there is a question. Have the individuals that we've elected, the 225 members of parliament who function as our legislature, and also certain members of that form the cabinet and function as the executive, are they doing exactly that? What can be done? What should be done? Stay tuned. You're watching Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජ නාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
එළිය හීනියට වහින වැහි පොද මුළු හිතම හිරිවට්ටල දානවා අප්පච්චි.
ඉස්සර මට හිටියේ එක පුතයි දුවල දෙන්නයි. දැන් පුතු 4 දෙනයි දුවල 4 දෙනෙක් ලැබෙනවා.
මේ උඹට පොඩ්ඩක් පුළුවන්ද මේ ලෝකෙට පොඩ්ඩක් ඇවිල්ලා යන්න? ඇඩ්වර්ටයිසින් කරන්න නැත්තම් මැරෙද්ද? ඔය දෙකේම වැඩි වෙනසක් නෑ මල්ලි. ඒක නෙමෙයි. ආවයි හාවිකෝ.
මම පුරුදු වෙනවා. සත්තයි.
මම මේ ඔය ළමයින්ගේ හොඳට මේවා කියන්නේ. ඔය ගෑනු ළමයා පන්නගෙන යන වැඩේ නම් හරියන්නේ නෑ.
සුදුහාමිනේ එකපාරටම වෙනස් වුණේ කොහොමද? මේ තරම් ඉක්මනට මේ වගේ ලොකු වෙනසක්
තනිව යන්න බෑයි කියන කාරණේද අධ්‍යාපනයේදී
මම කියන්නේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදුවෙන දේ.
අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව සීන සමාජවාදී ඒකත් හරියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක මේ කකුලට පොඩි. අපි අපේම සපත්තුව මහ ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් කවුන්සිලය කියලා කියන්නේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව ලෝක පාර්ලිමේන්තුව.
අපි පරිසරය ගැන දෙකක් නෙමෙයි.
මම ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලෙත් මේක තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්. දැන් මම මැරෙන්න යන කාලෙදිත් තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්.
ආණ්ඩුව රූපාන්තරණය වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය බවට.
එත දෙකේ එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැෂනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කවුද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද?
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not seconding to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID. This will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics. Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
Welcome back. You're watching Face the Nation. Of course, we're in discussion with three eminent members of Parliament on Sri Lanka's way forward. We discussed Sri Lanka's human rights record, and we discussed in detail the surcharge tax bill and Sri Lanka's tax policy and the economic crisis that we're facing right now, what really resulted in it, how are we to move forward. There is a question that we received from one of our viewers directed to Mr. Iran Vikramaratne. Now, the question is based on a statement that you made. You said that somewhere in 2018 or 2019, you increased the tax net by about 600,000 more taxpayers. The question is, was there an actual increase in tax revenue to the government, or was it just a paper increase, as in an estimate? Saying this many people have increased, so this much increases, or did you really receive that money from the general public as tax?
Yeah, and actually the revenue is increased, the tax revenue is increased in those years, and it's always measured in terms of percentage of GDP, right? And so there was actually an increase. I think if this had to be accompanied also by certain system changes. So we've also putting new information systems in. It's very important. As we all know, in Sri Lankan society, there are lots of leakages. It starts from your municipal council. You go down to get a plan passed or some extension to your house or, something like that. And everywhere you go, you hear this all the time from people. There are leakages. That's a nice way of saying corruption, right? Leakages. So you have this. And the leakages happen often when you have a lot of human discretion and interaction. So some of these things, for things like taxes, you can, if you have the systems in place and you can pay them online, there are no discussions and all, you pay them.
No underhand payments.
No underhand payments.
No dropping 1,000 rupee notes.
Right. That's right. And as Professor said a little while ago, Professor Tissa said, the payment is made. You can always appeal. There can be a system saying that I think this is unfair, or you have overcharged me, or I think I should get a refund, or whatever. So those systems were also being put in place. So it's not only the management systems he referred to, like both the appeals and all, but also information systems had to be put in place. And this work was actually going on, and it was very carefully done. There was a lot of study that went into it. It was systematically done, and we were also following best practices. This is nothing new, it's not rocket science. Around the world, best practices, take it and put it in place. So corruption is also a big issue in this country, right? Because there's a lot of impunity and people don't really pay a lot of attention. Now, I'm shy to say this, but I will say it anyway. For a short while, Sri Lankan Airlines was put under me as a minister. And when I was in opposition previous to that, I had been shouting a lot about, under the presidency of Mahinda Rajapaksa, that we were buying 8 new aircrafts and there was corruption. Now, obviously, I didn't have all the evidence.
I believe this was investigated by the Serious Frauds Office of the United Kingdom.
That's right, the Serious Frauds of the United Kingdom. And in 2021, there was a judgment given and they faulted Airbus of 5 countries that they had paid commission. Sri Lanka was named. The individuals who received it were also named, right? But Sri Lanka has done nothing about it. Then in 2021...
We didn't even inform the Serious Frauds Office that we will be claiming anything and we didn't get anything out of it.
That's the thing, nothing has been done, right? Then we had another judgment in a US federal court saying that an individual there had acted as a lobbyist. He was not a registered lobbyist. He had collected money from many countries, including Sri Lanka. On Sri Lanka, he had done a contract with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And millions of dollars had been paid. What for? To raise Sri Lanka's image. That's
to lobby.
Yes, a lobbyist, right? A so-called lobbyist, right? And money has been paid. That individual, Mr. Zubairi, was convicted by the federal court. He has been sent for 12 years imprisonment in the US, and Sri Lanka hasn't done anything. And I want to say this, right? Who in the monetary board approved it? Who in the central bank approved it? The present governor of the central bank was governor of the central bank even then, right? Even then. We have a huge issue here with the central bank, right? Huge issue with the central bank. And the huge issue with the central bank is, you have fiscal policy. We're talking of taxes today, fiscal policy. Then you have monetary policy, okay? Monetary policy must be independent from fiscal policy. Central banks around the world have 2 big responsibilities. One is financial sector stability. The second responsibility that the central bank has is control of inflation. For that, they have to have monetary independence. Now what's happening is we have a fiscal policy driven monetary policy. That is why this whole story about money printing is coming out. So what I'm saying is this: we have gone and put a politician as the governor of the central bank. I am objecting to these things in principle. In principle, I'm objecting to this. Not about so much about the individual, in principle, right? And therefore, the central bank is a place I have a very high regard for. Lots of professionals in there, educated people. People within the central bank must also stand up. Because the time will come, if things crash in this country, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka will be held responsible for it also.
I believe there was a protest held very recently also.
I saw that.
Individual...
I saw that on the media, and I'm worried, right?
Because that was just one individual.
Yes.
But how long until that one becomes 10, and that 10 becomes 100, and that 100 continues to multiply?
Yes, so that is why I think it's reaching a very dangerous, and I'm saying this because we need to protect the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. It's a very key institution in the country. Its independence must be protected. One of the things a future government will have to do, and I was talking of the last period, right? One of the things we did, but which we couldn't actually enact, was we looked at the Monetary Law Act, and we moved amendments in the Monetary Law Act to strengthen the independence of the central bank, right? But it never, we couldn't bring it to Parliament and we couldn't get it passed. But that is available in the Ministry of Finance. It's not anybody's private property. This government should look at it, right? And they have to really reconsider the fact of who is appointed to these positions, and then they have to look at that and adopt that law, because that is the protection that people will have.
One question to President's Counsel M.A. Sumantiran. I was watching your recent address in Parliament, I believe, on Thursday, when amendments were moved to the Criminal Procedure Code and also the Judicature Act. And you lashed out at members in the government, saying that there weren't ministers present in the government. We've been speaking about the issue of the quorum in Parliament being just 20 for many years now. Sometimes it costs about, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere close to 4 million for Parliament to convene per day. So all of this money is spent for Parliament to convene, but there are no members in Parliament to discuss these important matters that affect the general public of the country. Now, you expressed your anger in Parliament, President's Council M.A. Sumanthiran. What do you think should be done?
No, it was an instance where the first two rows were totally empty. And the third row, there was one member because he had just finished speaking, and then there were four members in the last row. The reason why I raised an objection was that government had brought a bill. Government had brought two bills to address this very important issue of loss delays. And having put that out for discussion, I was only the second speaker from the opposition, and none of the ministers were there. No cabinet minister, no state minister.
What if I maybe say that they were busy, solving other issues because Sri Lanka is having many issues right now? Would that be a valid excuse?
Well, I don't think that's a valid excuse. You don't come to Parliament, present a bill, and then disappear without some responsible member of government being there. I mean, if I wanted clarification, if I raised an issue, there was no one to give a reply. And then to rub salt into the wound, the five members who were there had their private conversation, and the speaker pulled them up for that. And then they promptly left the chamber. So then
there was no one there.
Then there was no one there.
So you were debating with yourself?
Well, yeah, talking to empty government benches. This is also a reflection on how the executive views the legislature. You see, we are supposed to have separation of powers, not quite like the US, but the system works with checks and balances. But here, Parliament is devalued to a great extent because half the Parliament is the executive. Anyway, and so now we had oversight committees that were introduced through amendment to the standing orders of Parliament, which is very, very important, which carries out very important functions of Parliament. The Parliament's work is not just in the chamber. You see, in committees we do that, and oversight committees exercise that parliamentary supervision. Right? Now that those are not functioning. No members have been appointed to the oversight committees. So it's so the Parliament, the legislature's functions, importance has been devalued to a great extent, which results in the executive not being challenged or held accountable to any of its actions.
President's Council Sumanthiran, you were speaking about accountability, checks and balances. There's this famous saying that goes, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Moving to Professor Tissa Vitharana, you're a member of the government. We saw since the President came into power, he's always preferred executive rule without the Parliament. We saw that initially when COVID-19 hit, Parliament was dissolved. I believe President's Council M.A. Sumanthiran went to court challenging the dissolution. However, after about a lapse of 8 months, we had a Parliament again. But every now and again we see the executive arm of the state, including the cabinet, disregarding the powers of Parliament completely, even to the extent where the Constitution itself reads that Parliament shall have control over public finances. President's Council Sumanthiran, do you think Parliament has control over public finances?
No, Parliament doesn't have. I mean, it's there in writing, it's in print, it's in the Constitution, but it's observed in the breach. No effective control is exercised by Parliament over public finances.
Professor Thisavitarana, so how do you respond to this?
I am totally opposed to the executive presidential system. That is we had a parliamentary system based on the Westminster
Professor
model.
Thisavitarana, can I just ask you one question?
Yeah.
Just for my reference. When the 20th Amendment was tabled in Parliament, did you vote for or against it?
Frankly, I was going to vote against it.
But did you vote for or against it?
Ultimately, I voted for it.
So, but then now you're being dishonest. Then you're being disingenuous.
We had a meeting with the president. The party leaders took a decision that we would not vote for it. Then we were told to have this immediate meeting with the president, and we said we are not in agreement with that. And then he gave an undertaking that within 1 year there will be a new constitution where this will be rectified.
Has there been a new constitution?
Huh?
Has it been 1 year?
Not yet.
So, I mean, Professor Thisavitarana, you come here and you say in principle that you're against the executive presidency, but you go and you vote in favor of the executive presidency, or the 20th Amendment that strengthened the executive presidency. A person who is watching this program right now would have a little bit of an issue believing, you said you are against taxing the people, but maybe if the president gives an undertaking that he'll tax the general public only once, maybe you might agree. Is that a possibility?
No. You see, the point is this, as a part of a government, there is collective responsibility. And for instance, from my party, I'm the sole representative, right? So the amount of power that I have within that parliament is minimal.
But Professor Thisavitarana, just to be extremely honest with you, I don't believe that the power of a parliament or a government can be determined by mere numbers. I think the current situation in the country is the best example for that. This is by far one of the strongest governments that has been in power and was elected purely from an election. Many other governments that had 2/3 majority in parliament were, a change of heads, people jumping from the opposition to the government. But this government was purely elected by the people, purely elected by the people. Do you think they have power over the people, or they have the goodwill of the people? There are members of the government who are saying that they can't even go to their villages.
Yes.
So I don't believe that point, the fact that you don't have enough power in the government just because you're a sole representative. Your voice can be heard and your voice will be heard, and that is why we are providing you this opportunity, even on shows like this.
Yeah. You see, the Parliament as the sole representative of the people, both executive and legislative, is, in my view, the ideal situation. Now we have deviated from that. Executive system has been, on the American model, has been imposed on a British model, Westminster system, where the voters then elected their representatives to Parliament, and the voice of the people was through Parliament and Parliament alone. Now when you go and have an executive president who has supreme power, you are upsetting that balance.
Professor Thisavitarana, as a member of the general public who vested our sovereignty in you, the representatives of the people, can I fault you for contributing to creating such an all-powerful executive? Can I fault you? If I fault you, would you say, no, you're wrong? Would you say that?
I have, wherever possible, indicated my opposition to that change.
But where you should have indicated your opposition, you didn't, Professor.
No, as I told you, that I was going to even then stay without voting. There was the group of us party leaders who met the president and were given the assurance that there would be this change with the new constitution. So even then, my reaction, my gut reaction was not to vote either way, just to stay neutral. But when I turned to everyone else and said this is what I feel, no one supported me. The others were all saying, well, now the head of government has said that has given this undertaking, therefore we must
Okay, Professor, let's say, Professor, that you relied on this undertaking and then you voted in favor of this amendment. But now it's been 1 year since the amendment has been passed. So technically, by the definition of the word, you've been lied to. What are you going to do about that, Professor?
Well, I don't know what I can do about it. But
didn't you think that there would be a possibility where this wouldn't happen?
I didn't, because I
you believed in the government so much.
No, I mean one has to.
I'm extremely sorry, Professor, to put you on the spot, but I'm just
but
asking you because I'm curious.
If people in responsible positions make statements which are important, the natural tendency is to accept that they will be implemented. If they are not implemented, that is something that we find out later down the line.
Professor, did the President give the assurance that the executive presidency will be abolished?
No, he said he will see that there will be, that our protest, our points of view will be taken into consideration in the formulation of a new constitution.
Professor, now based on your statements, what I can sort of decipher is that you have been deceived, basically. The President has not done what he promised. What is stopping you from joining the opposition now?
Well, I'm totally opposed to the policies of the opposition.
Do you support the policies of the government now?
You sound like a member of
opposition. Professor, how would you distinguish yourself from the views that are being expressed even on this show by the opposition lawmakers? Do you agree with the government's policies in the first place?
No.
Very broad question.
Look, one doesn't take a position with regard to being in a party or against a party just on one issue. There is a whole question of the policies en bloc of that particular party or government.
But Professor, now you consider the policies, the decisions that the government has made. Now one thing is the 20th Amendment, that's a different story. But since then, what a lot has happened, Professor. We have the fertilizer crisis, we have the sugar scam, then there is a crisis brewing within the government itself, cost of living, inflation is rising, all these issues. How many more issues do you need, Professor, to make a call on
that? Those are issues, but not, shall I say,
it's okay to remain in the government.
Not deal breakers. They're not deal breakers.
That would necessitate a complete change from one set of policies to another set of policies.
Thank you very much, Professor Tissavitharan. Unfortunately, since we're pressed for time, we will have to move on to the final segment of Face the Nation. Of course, it's the closing statements. Each individual panelist will get an opportunity to make their closing statements. But of course, we do request the panelists to limit yourself to the matters that were discussed during the show. Do not bring up new arguments because, of course, as it is, Professor Tissavitharan is at a disadvantage given the fact that he's facing off against two opposition members. And Professor Tissavitharan will, of course, get the final say as the representative of the government. So let's start off with the same It's the same order that we began with. President's Counsel M.A. Sumantaran, your closing statement. You will have a total period of 5 minutes.
Thank you. Let me thank you at the end of the show for inviting me to be part of this tonight. The country is facing multiple crises, not least the economic crisis. I think that's the paramount issue before the country, and the government seems to be faltering there, which is putting the lives of all the citizens at risk. And
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
And as we have said jointly with the other two members here and others, have that negotiation at a time when we are able to ensure in whatever way that the poor are not poor do not suffer, and the social security measures that are in place are maintained. Secondly, you started off with the questions on human rights situation in the country. Again, the government is remiss, not just remiss, but is in the wrong, traveling in the wrong direction. It's oppressive at the moment. Dissent is being suppressed. We heard a few hours before we came for this show, a prominent civil society activist,
Shehan Malaka.
Yes, Malaka being arrested for calling on the government to do its job. You know, I was looking at that section under which he is supposed to have been arrested, section 120 of the Penal Code, and the explanation to that section says that you know, legitimate criticism of the government is not an offence. To call on the government to do what it ought to do, and he has only been calling on the government to do a proper investigation on the Easter attack, and he had the facts and figures that he brought out, and it's a pity that he is being arrested. The one who calls on the government to do a proper investigation to find the culprits is being arrested, while the culprits are free to roam. Right? They are not being pursued. So that sort of sums up
A situation like shooting the messenger.
Yeah, that's right. And that sort of sums up the security situation of the country. Once you start this kind of using this kind of oppression on the people, it's a very, very dangerous trend. And so on the one hand, the economy is at an all-time low, and people are suffering as a result and are looking at more suffering. And then you have an oppressive government that is walking all over its citizens' rights, and so we are in a situation where you know, the people of the country have to stand up and change this situation. So as we face the nation, that's my call to the nation, to rise up and protect yourself, because the government is not just not doing it, but is suppressing you.
Thank you very much, President's Counsel M.A. Sumantaran. I move my attention now to parliamentarian Iran Vikramaratne from the Samagi Chana Balavegia. Your time starts now.
Yes, the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a draconian act. It basically can lock up a person up to 18 months. It doesn't have to produce the person before a magistrate like the normal law would require within 48 hours. It also denies the accused from, if they have been indicted before the High Court, of actually the judge deciding on bail. It also makes confessions made to a police officer admissible, you say, which is really ridiculous. If it's a confession before the magistrate, then that's fine. So really, the present law is an affront to the independence of the judiciary, the way it is already, right? So these 4 conditions, right, have to be eliminated. But these 4 conditions are not being dealt with the proposed amendments that the government has tabled in Parliament. Therefore, we have to reject this in toto, the amendments in toto. The PT has been misused to hold, political opponents, journalists, human rights activists, and so forth. We've seen in the recent past the Honorable Rishad Baduddin, we have seen Azad Saleh, then Hejaz, the young lawyer, Ahanaf, the prophet, the being held, used in different ways, right? Basically misused. And as Professor Vittarana said, we are not in this kind of terrorist era at the moment, but it's being used. So this needs to be repealed. But it needs to be not just repealed, but repealed and replaced, you see. And the SJB, we have taken that position. In the past, there was an attempt to actually bring a new act, right? But it didn't basically come to fruition and to Parliament, and basically got delayed on the way and was not passed. In 2016, the Law Commission of Sri Lanka, which has lots of eminent legal personalities in it. It was chaired at that time by Mr. Ramesh De Silva, the President's Counsel. It was chaired by him. And they came up with a new draft, right? So our position is, right, repeal the present one and replace it, right, with a new one, and that draft could be used as the new one. Now the government often says that the opposition comes and criticizes, but is not very constructive. I'm saying clearly here, repeal the present PTA and replace it with the Law Commission draft of 2016. And there were eminent personalities when that was actually drafted, and as was mentioned, President's Counsel Ramesh De Silva was chair of it, and after all, he is the government's chair on constitutional reform as well. So I think that needs to be very closely looked at. We are stepping in really into a more volatile era. Now today we heard the attack on a media person, Chamudita, an attack on his house, which we completely deplorable. People could have different political views, but it is totally unacceptable. And I'm asking for a very clear, clean investigation on that. Shehan Malaka's name was mentioned on the basis that he has made a statement on the Easter bombing, and he has asked for basically for justice. Why has Shehan Malaka been actually taken? I mean, this kind of nonsense must stop. In the past we have seen others being harassed, others being taken. Then we just heard this evening again that Manorama Veerasinghe, a social media activist, has been summoned to the CID. No reasons have been given, but summoned to the CID, basically for conversation. This is also seen as intimidation, right? So somehow or other, we are moving away, from actually the rule of law, right, into a new area. So the government must investigate, right? I don't have to come to this channel and talk about journalists and channels coming under pressure, because this channel has faced that in the past also, and therefore even though we ourselves as a political party often which feels that we don't get fair representation on all the channels, will still stand up for those channels, you see, and for the journalists who represent those channels, because we believe in a free media and different people can express themselves differently. That is a part of democracy, and therefore so we would say that first repeal the PTA, replace it with the new act, and secondly, right, the media must be protected, and the media, the free media must be permitted, because it's also a pillar of democracy.
Thank you very much, Parliamentarian Iran Vikramaratne from the Samagi Janabalawegya. Well, our final speaker for the night, the final say goes to Professor Tisavitarana, Chairman of COPA. Professor Tisavitarana, you said that sometimes you feel that the power you have within the government is less because you're the only person representing your party. Professor, this is your opportunity to make your voice heard, not just to the government, but to the people as well. Your time starts now.
While I don't defend the actions which have been criticized by my friends here, I think we have to also take into account the fact that both globally as well as locally, the world is faced with an acute economic crisis. There is also a big health problem associated with the COVID-19 virus. All that have had an effect on all economies, and small economies in particular, like Sri Lanka. So the government is faced with a big battle to ensure that the needs of the people are met under these trying conditions. I'm not trying to be apologetic, but I'm trying to put the facts on the table.
Speak the truth.
Yeah. So in this context, certain things are being done hurriedly, without adequate thought, without proper consideration of the consequences, right? Which I don't approve, but which are understandable in my point of view. Now, in this context, we have to firstly see that everyone is saved from hunger, has food. Now, I think there the government should give that the highest priority, not highways, etc. Then, when it comes to the other needs of society, there has to be, one is, there has to be very strong action against corruption and abuse of power also, I would include.
You're in a position of power now, Professor. You can definitely work on that.
Yes, I'm certainly against any type of abuse of power. Right? And some of these things have been going on for years. It's not only with this government.
Decades, you mean?
Yeah, for decades. So we've got to, in a situation of crisis, put the house in order, which is not easy. Right? So, unfortunately, there isn't enough discussion and analysis of the nature of the crisis that we are confronted with, and the priorities that we should identify and take effective action against. As I told you earlier, I think one of the priorities is the question of hunger and ensuring that they have food. And similarly, we have to see that the basic needs of everyone are met with regard to food, etc. So, I would call or appeal for a more, a wider, shall we say, I was in at the meeting that was referred to earlier, where people from both the government and the opposition got together and agreed that there was a severe crisis confronting the country and the people.
Professor Tisavitara,
and that we should get together, both government and the opposition, and solve it. And
please permit me to just interrupt you just 1 second there, because you are a member of the government. There is concern among both the opposition and the people of this country as to if the true decision makers within the government are aware and are accepting the fact that we are facing a crisis. Do they accept and are aware of that?
I'm afraid this has not happened to the extent that it should.
Okay. So they are aware, but not to the extent that...
I would say, tell the people the true situation, the economy, the state of the economy, both internationally and nationally, the crisis that we are faced with. We have a dollar crisis, right? Not only the tourist industry is down, the remittances are down, our product sales abroad are down. So it's that total picture which must be made known to the people, and it is in that context that we must call upon the people to say, let us tighten our belts and face this situation. And here I am critical of the government that the burden is not being placed properly where it should be placed. As I have mentioned earlier, the tax policy, in my view, is completely wrong.
Thank you very much, Professor Tisavitara. Of course, you have always been firm in your resolve. Of course, we hope and pray that your views are heard inside Parliament and at important places where decisions of this country are made. Because, like you called on the government to make the people aware of the true situation that the country is facing. The first step in solving any problem is to first identify and accept that there is a problem itself. Thank you very much, President's Council M.A. Sumantiran, a parliamentarian of the Tamil National Alliance, Professor Tisavitara, Chairman of COPA, and Mr. Iran Vikramaratne, parliamentarian from the Samagi Janabala Begye, for joining us this evening. Also, thank you to our journalist for posing the hard questions, Harsan Shazuli, and the famous Shehan Ranatunga. Thank you very much for joining us on Face the Nation, and thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in and keeping yourselves abreast of these the political situation in the country, of course, because this will affect each and every one of you. I'll leave you tonight, of course, with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty of the bad people, but the silence of the good people. Take care. God bless.
TV1 රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ
मुझे छू न जाए मेरे ये मेरे पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पल पल तुझको करते मिस पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स I know you want my baby lips
Baby lips are cold again. हरकत करे नोड़िया. Missing in the whole day. Love you मैंने बोले रामा तेरी रही रानिया. Yo, hello boy again. Baby lips are cold again. हरकत करे नोड़िया. Missing in the whole day. Love you मैंने बोले रामा तेरी रही रानिया.
मेरी ख्वाहिशों को तलब है तेरी करीब हाँ अब कर न देरी मेरी ख्वाहिशों को तलब है तेरी करीब हाँ अब कर न देरी तेरे फासले मुझे चलाने लगे रफ्तार सांसों की बढ़ाने लगे तू आजा पास ये बुलाने लगे तेरी बात पुकारे मेरे ये मेरे पिंक लिप्स पिंक लिप्स